Under the blazing Pacific sun of June 19, 1944, the air above the Philippine Sea boiled with motion. Japanese pilots of the Imperial Navy's elite, veterans from Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, climbed into their Zeros, laughing in the cockpit radios as they spotted the lumbering shapes of incoming American aircraft. Big and clumsy, one pilot sneered, banking his Mitsubishi A6M toward what looked like another easy kill. The aircraft they mocked was painted deep blue, its wings wide and squared, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. To Japanese eyes, it was overweight, sluggish, and far from elegant. But as the first wave closed, the laughter died. The clumsy, American machines didn't turn to flee. They charged straight in, engines screaming at full throttle, guns erupting in synchronized fury. In seconds, the sky turned into a graveyard of burning Zeros. That day, in what would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft fell to the sea. Many never even reached the American carriers. Radar-guided interception and Hellcat formations working in perfect coordination shredded the once-feared air arm of Japan. The shock rippled across the Pacific. For years, the Imperial Navy had dominated the air, believing its pilots invincible. Now they faced an enemy that seemed faster, deadlier, and somehow always one step ahead. It was the beginning of a new kind of air war, and the Hellcat was its instrument of vengeance. To understand how the Americans had turned the tide, one must return 2 years earlier, back to a time when U.S. naval aviation was reeling. In early 1942, after Pearl Harbor and the devastating early months in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy's aircraft were simply outclassed. The F-4F Wildcat, dependable but outdated, struggled to match the agility of Japan's A6M0. At Coral Sea and Midway, U.S. pilots fought bravely but paid in blood for every victory. Many American planes lacked the climb rate or turn radius to survive prolonged dogfights. The Navy needed something entirely new, an aircraft that could both outfight and outlast the enemy. At Grumman's plant in Bethpage, Long Island, engineers led by Leroy Grumman, William Schwendler, and Jake Swerble worked around the clock. They studied every field report from the Pacific, pilots' desperate notes, bullet-riddled wings shipped back from carriers, and fragments of Japanese wrecks. What they built would become a symbol of American adaptation. The F6F Hellcat was not designed for beauty, it was designed for dominance. With a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, thick armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, it embodied raw industrial might forged by necessity. The first prototypes flew in June 1942, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Early test pilots described its power as terrifying. It could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute and reach a top speed of 376 miles per hour, fast enough to chase down a Zero and still have fuel to return home. The aircraft's broad wingspan and hydraulic folding system made it ideal for carrier decks, while its cockpit provided something most Japanese fighters never offered: visibility and protection. Even if the Hellcat took hits, it could bring its pilot back alive. American designers knew that wars weren't won by perfect machines, they were won by pilots who lived long enough to learn. By mid-1943, the Hellcat entered combat over the Solomon Islands. The first encounters shocked the Japanese. American planes no longer fell easily from the sky. Their heavy guns tore through the fragile aluminum of Zeros with a single burst. Pilots who once claimed 5 kills before breakfast now found themselves outmatched. The Hellcat's armor shrugged off 7.7mm rounds that would have shredded a Wildcat. More crucially, it could dive and climb with brutal speed, exploiting the one weakness Japan could not fix: engine power. As word spread, American morale surged. Pilots returning from sorties described the Hellcat as a forgiving beast. It could take punishment, and it could give more. Navy instructors began reshaping tactics around it: boom and zoom attacks, coordinated formations, and altitude advantage. Radar on the carriers directed them to intercept Japanese raids long before visual contact. The combination of new technology and rugged design began to change the Pacific Air War into something Japan was never prepared to fight: a war of attrition, guided by machines that refused to die. Meanwhile, inside Japan's own command structure, alarm bells rang. Pilots reported that these new American planes could climb higher and turn inside the zero at high speeds. The old doctrines of lightweight agility no longer applied. Yet, the Imperial Navy refused to believe that mass-produced American aircraft could equal the handcrafted precision of Japanese design. Many officers still viewed the American pilot as inferior, a blunt instrument relying on quantity over skill. They would soon learn that industrial power, when guided by intelligence and discipline, could produce a weapon far deadlier than elegance alone. By early 1944, entire U.S. carrier groups bristled with Hellcats. From the decks of the USS Yorktown, Lexington, and Enterprise, squadrons launched in tight precision, engines roaring like an approaching storm. Their pilots, young men barely out of training, had confidence their predecessors never knew. They called their aircraft the Ace Maker. For good reason. The Hellcat would produce more aces than any other Allied fighter of the war. Japanese pilots, many veterans from China and the early Pacific triumphs, faced dwindling experience among their own ranks. Replacement training had grown rushed, fuel was scarce, and aircraft quality had declined. When the massive carrier battle erupted over the Marianas, the contrast was absolute. American pilots flew in disciplined formations, guided by radar intercept vectors, maintaining radio silence until the final strike. Japanese formations, by contrast, fragmented under pressure. Their radio coordination was poor, their aircraft, lighter but underpowered, could no longer sustain high-altitude flights. The Hellcats tore through them. Each engagement brought scenes of surreal imbalance, veterans of Pearl Harbor diving toward death as waves of blue-winged fighters swept them from the sky. By the end of that single day, the once proud Japanese naval air arm was effectively destroyed. More than 3,000 pilots had perished since the start of the Pacific War, and there were few left with experience to replace them. In Tokyo, disbelief turned to panic. Reports arrived describing American aircraft that could absorb hits and still maneuver, that never seemed to run out of ammunition, and that came from carriers impossible to locate. These weren't exaggerations. The Hellcat had become the face of a new kind of American warfare, industrial, methodical, and relentless. Behind every sortie stood the combined might of Detroit, Chicago, and Long Island. Behind every pilot, the lessons of those who had died learning how to fight. By nightfall over the Philippine Sea, smoke hung low across the ocean. Burning aircraft illuminated the horizon like falling stars. On the decks of American carriers, young pilots removed their helmets, drenched in sweat, stunned by what they had just done. They had fought the most experienced air force in the Pacific, and won decisively. The laughter of their enemies had vanished into the sea. But the question lingered in every briefing room across the fleet: how had the Americans, once mocked as inferior, managed to leap so far ahead so quickly? What invisible force, beyond courage or luck, had allowed these Hellcats to dominate skies once ruled by the zero? The answer lay not just in the pilots but in the unseen world of engineers, factories, and codebreakers, a vast network of minds and machines working behind the front lines. And as the Pacific burned, those secrets were about to be revealed. The secret behind the Hellcats' supremacy began long before the guns of the Pacific roared. It was born in the quiet hum of American factories, in the clatter of rivet guns, and in the ink-stained blueprints of engineers who believed victory could be designed. In 1942, Grumman engineers Leroy Grumman and William Schwendler faced an impossible directive: build a fighter powerful enough to crush the Zero, yet simple enough for mass production and rough carrier landings. They responded with American practicality. Instead of chasing elegance, they built resilience. Every inch of the F6F Hellcat was deliberate, a flying fortress wrapped in steel and horsepower. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine delivered 2,000 horsepower, pushing the aircraft to 376 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. It could climb faster than any Japanese plane, dive without tearing its wings apart, and shrug off hits that would shred an A6M0. The design team's mantra was survival. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fiery deaths. The thick windshield could stop a bullet. Armor plating surrounded the pilot from head to waist. The landing gear was reinforced for brutal deck impacts. Even its wide, square wings, mocked by Japanese pilots, gave it stability during carrier takeoffs and low-speed maneuvers. "It's not pretty," one engineer joked during testing, "but it'll bring you home." That promise would make all the difference. In mid-1943, the Hellcat was deployed aboard carriers across the Solomon Islands. Its first major test came over Marcus Island. 12 F6Fs engaged a squadron of Japanese Zeros. In minutes, the American pilots destroyed 8 enemy aircraft with no losses. Word spread rapidly through the fleet. Pilots reported that the Hellcat turned like a dream at high speed, its rugged airframe forgiving even reckless dives. Maintenance crews praised its simple construction. Panels could be replaced quickly with factory-standard parts, keeping squadrons flying despite combat damage. Behind the front lines, America's industrial power surged. At Grumman's Bethpage facility, assembly lines ran day and night. In a single year, over 12,000 Hellcats rolled out, each one tested, fueled, and shipped directly to carrier task forces. Women and men worked side by side in the plant, riveting fuselages and wiring cockpits. They called it the Iron Works, and it earned its name. The Navy's logistics machine moved with astonishing precision. Spare engines, propellers, and ammunition boxes were tracked, packed, and loaded onto supply ships headed west. While Japanese industry struggled to replace losses, America built more planes than Japan could shoot down. But power alone didn't guarantee victory. The real transformation came from the way the Hellcat was used. The Navy's flight schools adopted a new doctrine based on hard-earned combat reports. Instead of turning duels, pilots were taught energy fighting, climb high, dive fast, and strike once. The Hellcat's power made this possible. Instructors at Pensacola drilled young aviators to exploit their aircraft's strengths, attack from altitude, avoid tight spirals, and use teamwork. Every squadron operated as a single organism, with radar intercepts guiding them into perfect ambushes. One of the defining moments came on February 16, 1944, when Task Force 58 launched Operation Hailstone against the Japanese stronghold at Truk Lagoon. It was Japan's Pearl Harbor in reverse. More than 500 American aircraft, mostly Hellcats, stormed the skies above the Caroline Islands. The battle unfolded with surgical precision. Hellcats strafed airfields, destroyed 250 Japanese planes, and cleared the way for dive bombers and torpedo strikes. Over 2 days, 40 ships were sunk. Truk, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was left smoldering. Pilots described the Hellcat as unstoppable. It took hits, it kept flying, and it dominated every engagement. In post-battle debriefs, captured Japanese officers expressed disbelief. Their Zeros, though still graceful, couldn't outclimb or outrun the new American fighter. The Hellcat's rugged construction made conventional dogfighting suicidal. "We could see their bullets spark against our wings," one American pilot recounted. But the Hellcat didn't flinch. The tide had turned so completely that Japanese commanders began urging pilots to avoid direct engagement unless outnumbering the enemy 2-to-1, a ratio that soon became impossible to achieve. Meanwhile, on the decks of carriers like the USS Lexington and Enterprise, the Hellcat's reliability redefined naval warfare. Maintenance crews could patch a damaged plane in hours. Engines swapped overnight. Even after brutal sorties, the aircraft returned to the air the next morning. Japanese reports often described entire American squadrons returning to fight again just hours after being supposedly destroyed. What the Japanese didn't realize was that American logistics, combined with the Hellcat's modular design, had made carrier air power sustainable in a way Japan could never match. The technical advantages kept multiplying. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns could fire 2,400 rounds per minute combined, saturating targets with deadly precision. Its ammunition belts carried armor-piercing incendiary rounds capable of slicing through engine blocks. The plane's bulletproof windshield allowed head-on attacks, something Zero pilots could never risk. Its range exceeded 1,000 miles, allowing deep strikes on enemy convoys and bases. When fitted with external drop tanks, it could escort bombers across vast ocean distances. The aircraft that had once been mocked as heavy and ungainly had become the most lethal predator in the Pacific skies. By summer 1944, the Hellcats' kill ratio had reached an unprecedented 19-1. Out of every 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed, only one Hellcat was lost. No other fighter in history had achieved such dominance over so wide a front. American pilots who once felt outclassed now hunted in packs, confident in their machines and their tactics. "They laughed at us 2 years ago," one Navy ace remarked. "But the joke's over." One mission, however, would define the Hellcats' legacy. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were launched to attack the American fleet. Radar picked them up 150 miles out. Hellcat squadrons scrambled, forming layered defensive screens. As the Japanese closed in, wave after wave was cut down before even sighting the carriers. Pilots called it a turkey shoot. By the end of the day, more than 350 Japanese planes were destroyed. The sea was littered with wreckage. American losses totaled barely a handful. In the chaos, one Hellcat pilot, Ensign Alexander Vrashu, shot down 6 enemy dive bombers in 8 minutes, earning ace status in a single sortie. Stories like his became symbols of what the aircraft represented, not just firepower, but the union of human skill and machine perfection. The Hellcat had made ordinary men into heroes and turned the tide of a war once thought unwinnable. But the triumph wasn't only in the skies. It was in the relentless hum of factories thousands of miles away, in the calculations of engineers who refined each bolt and bearing, and in the command centers where radar operators tracked the enemy long before the battle began. Japan had been defeated not merely by pilots but by a system that connected machine, man, and industry into one unstoppable force. Still, as the fires of the Philippine Sea dimmed, American commanders knew that the war was far from over. The Hellcat had given them control of the skies. But what would that control mean when the fighting moved closer to Japan itself, where the enemy would defend every inch with desperation and fanatic resolve? The next chapter of the Hellcat's story would test not just its power but the spirit of those who flew it. By the closing months of 1944, the Pacific skies had changed forever. The Zero, once the terror of the ocean, had become a ghost of its former glory. The Hellcat now ruled uncontested. Wherever American carrier task forces sailed, the deep blue wings followed, blotting out the sun in swarms of disciplined formation. The Japanese command understood what it meant. Air supremacy had slipped irreversibly into American hands. But the Hellcat's victory was not simply about numbers or machinery. It was about the transformation of warfare itself, from the daring of lone pilots to the orchestration of entire systems. The Hellcat's dominance reshaped every aspect of the Pacific campaign. With air superiority secured, the U.S. Navy advanced relentlessly through the Central Pacific. At Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Hellcats provided cover for landing Marines, strafing pillboxes, supply dumps, and artillery positions. Pilots attacked with precision, coordinating with naval gunfire and ground spotters. Each sortie illustrated a brutal truth: Japan could no longer defend its island fortresses from the sky. Airfields once protected by elite aviators now became death traps, their planes destroyed on the ground before they ever took off. The psychological shift was enormous. For the first time, American soldiers and sailors looked upward and saw safety instead of fear. On the Japanese side, despair set in. Veteran pilots had been lost faster than they could be replaced, and training programs grew desperate. Young recruits, some barely out of high school, were thrown into cockpits with less than 100 flying hours. They faced seasoned American aces flying aircraft designed to forgive mistakes and amplify precision. In debriefings after the war, captured Japanese officers described watching a generation of boys vanish in the clouds. To them, the Hellcats symbolized the industrial nightmare Japan could not escape, a war machine so vast that individual bravery no longer mattered. The engineering that powered this transformation continued to evolve. As production lines matured, Grumman introduced refinements, improved armor layouts, better radio equipment, radar altimeters, and night fighter variants fitted with and /APS-6 radar. These, Hellcat night fighters, hunted Japanese bombers under moonlight, guided by radar operators stationed aboard carriers. For the first time, American naval aviation could fight around the clock. What had begun as an emergency response to defeat had now become a weapon of total dominance. The human element of this success was immense. Pilots trained under the new combat air patrol doctrines developed by naval strategists like Admiral Mark Mitcher and Vice Admiral John Towers. They learned to trust technology, radar direction, radio coordination, and formation discipline. The old romantic image of the lone duelist faded into memory. Now warfare belonged to those who could integrate. The Hellcat wasn't just a plane, it was a node in a vast web of communication and logistics stretching from the Pacific to the American mainland. Psychologically, this shift was devastating for Japan. Post-war interrogations revealed that many pilots entered battle expecting death. Morale crumbled under the weight of industrial imbalance. Some described the American aircraft as unkillable, and their tactics as inhumanly coordinated. Japanese commanders struggled to motivate recruits who no longer believed victory possible. That despair fed directly into the rise of kamikaze tactics. Deprived of conventional means to fight the Hellcat, Japan turned to desperation. Yet even this horrific strategy was blunted by the same American machine. Hellcat pilots formed the first defensive barriers against suicide attacks, intercepting kamikazes miles from the fleet. Hundreds of ships were saved by these intercepts. As the Allies moved closer to Japan's home islands, the Hellcat played a central role in every major battle. During the invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945, F6Fs roared overhead from the carriers off the Bonin Islands, suppressing anti-aircraft positions and escorting bombers striking Tokyo. At Okinawa, they flew thousands of sorties against entrenched defenses, intercepting enemy raids and softening ground resistance. By then, the Hellcat's kill ratio had climbed beyond imagination, over 5,000 confirmed kills to fewer than 300 losses in air-to-air combat. Each engagement reinforced the lesson: technology and training could overcome even the fiercest warrior spirit. Back home, the production of Hellcats became a symbol of American unity. Newspapers printed photos of factory workers signing the fuselage of completed aircraft, their names flying into combat thousands of miles away. Women who had never seen the ocean now helped build the planes that ruled above it. The war industry became a living organism, steel, oil, sweat, and intellect fused into a single purpose. Engineers constantly studied reports from the front to refine small details: armor plating around the oil cooler, improved carburetor intake screens, and faster hydraulic pumps. The Hellcat was not just maintained, it was evolved in real time by a nation determined to perfect it. The strategic impact reached beyond the Pacific. Allied commanders studying the Hellcat's success realized that air superiority was no longer a luxury, it was the foundation of modern warfare. The idea of controlling the skies before committing ground forces became doctrine, shaping military thinking for decades to come. During the Cold War, American jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre and F-14 Tomcat carried the Hellcat's lineage forward: speed, survivability, and overwhelming firepower as the core of deterrence. Even today, the principles that define the Hellcat's design live on in the aircraft that patrol modern skies. But the legacy wasn't only mechanical. The pilots who flew the Hellcat carried its lessons into peacetime. Many became test pilots, instructors, and aerospace pioneers. Some would guide NASA's earliest programs, taking the discipline learned in carrier combat into the age of rockets. Their memories of the war were etched not only in victory but in loss: the friends who never returned, the missions that ended in flame and silence. To them, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a guardian that had given them a fighting chance in a war where survival had once seemed impossible. For Japan, the defeat carried a different legacy. The Hellcat forced a reckoning with the limits of individual heroism and the power of industry. After the war, Japanese engineers studied captured aircraft, marveling at their simplicity and durability. Many of those same engineers would go on to build the foundations of Japan's post-war technological renaissance, transforming the nation from a shattered empire into a global industrial power. In that sense, the Hellcat's shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield. It altered how nations understood progress itself. By the time production ceased in November 1945, 12,275 Hellcats had been built. They had flown more than 66,000 combat sorties, destroyed over 75% of all Japanese aircraft downed by U.S. Navy pilots, and secured the skies for victory. Their dominance was so complete that the plane became almost invisible in its inevitability. Yet behind that inevitability lay the courage of thousands, pilots, mechanics, engineers, and factory workers, each one a link in the chain that turned defeat into supremacy. In the final weeks of the war, as B-29s firebombed Tokyo and carriers patrolled unopposed, a few surviving Japanese pilots took to the air in one last act of defiance. They knew they couldn't win. They flew into the clouds anyway, searching for the same blue shapes that had haunted them for years. When the first Hellcats appeared, engines roaring, guns flashing, the end was clear. When peace came, veterans from both sides remembered those skies with awe and sorrow. "It was a monster," one Japanese survivor said years later. "But it was a beautiful monster." The F6F Hellcat had begun as an answer to defeat. It ended as a symbol of dominance, and a lesson written in smoke and steel. In modern war, victory belongs not only to the brave, but to those who can build, adapt, and endure.